If you don't think we live in an environment that can be quite toxic, I want you to think about this. A new environmental international study revealed that breast milk is often contaminated by environmental pollutants, including those that can disrupt hormonal balance, brain development, and establishment of the gut microbiome in an infant. So in today's episode, we're bringing on a functional medicine expert to see how we can not only navigate a world full of toxins, but thrive in it. This is the story of thriving in a toxic world with Dr. Jill Carnahan. Dr. Carnahan, so good to see you again.
You too. It's so fun to just reminisce about how we met, and here we are.
Well, we met at the biohacking conference last year. You gave a great talk there. And, before we go into all these things of biohacking, mold, environmental toxins that are disturbing so many people, I wanted you to just give us the backdrop of how you got into functional medicine and your backstory.
You got it. And I love starting here because story frames everything. And clearly for me, it was no different. I grew up on a farm in central Illinois, and so was probably well water and all kinds of things with organophosphates and pesticides and things like that, classical, central Illinois farming. But I had a mother, father who were very health conscious. We grew our own food, not all of it, but like we had a garden and kind of like open-minded to those kind of things to help us live well and thrive. And I never, ever in a million years really had the plan to go into medicine, but I knew that I was a healer at my heart. And I knew that I wanted to do something that would make a difference in the world. And I looked at all the different schools of therapy, physical therapy and chiropractic and all the kinds of things. And I ended up choosing allopathic conventional medical doctor as a degree because I realized our system is still highly reimbursed by the system, at least in the US. And I wanted to actually infiltrate and make a change from within and start to move the needle. And I knew that the best place would be getting a great medical education and then taking that knowledge and kind of starting to shift and move and be open-minded to how do we really thrive in this toxic world. So that's my backstory. Kind of surprisingly got into medical school, was at Loyola in Chicago. And then my third year medical student, I found a lump in my breast. Didn't think anything of it, but within a couple of weeks, I got a call from the surgeon, and I found out I had a very aggressive breast cancer at 25 years old. So this was obviously shocking and not expected. And many people don't know this, but women in their 50s and 60s, we all know someone who's had breast cancer. It's incredibly common and increasingly so. But at 25, it's like a death sentence. I was one of a group of about 12 women under 40, and I'm the only one still living. So it just shows you how serious this was. And so I went at it very aggressively, and I was advised to do conventional chemotherapy, 3 drugs, 6 rounds, surgery, radiation, the whole works. So I was faced with knowing I wanted to live holistically, naturally, heal myself from within, all those good things. And then all of a sudden I have a life-threatening illness at 25. And am I going to live or die? And what's interesting is I took their advice. I did the conventional treatment, but what I did is I altered the course a little. I did chemotherapy in 2 days instead of 1. I did it timed so that it was less toxic. I did lots of things, and I took nutritional supplements. I did prayer, fasting, meditation, all the kinds of things there. And I pulled these 2 worlds together. And after 9 months of therapy, I was incredibly sick from the therapy, but I was considered in remission. And now it's been almost 20 years and I'm considered cured. So it worked. But what's interesting, Casper, that people don't tell you is the cancer was easy. Like that was easy to battle and get over. And by understanding what were the toxins, like you mentioned, cord blood, I grew up on a farm, I had well water. I actually believe to have a cancer at 25, I probably had in utero exposure in my mother's womb to toxic chemicals like atrazine and organophosphates. And I had a very poor detox genetics wise. And so this actually started to cause mutations on the DNA of my breast cells, probably at 5 or 10 years old, like decades before my cancer. So to me, it kind of makes sense that I grew up on a farm. I was very susceptible to that toxic effect, which is our conversation today. So my life passion is how do we understand the toxic load on our bodies and what it contributes to? So I got back into medical school. I'm 26. I'm finishing up my degree. I was bald from the chemo, but my spirit was still strong. And wouldn't you know it, 6 months later, I am in the hospital again, and I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. Now, Crohn's is an autoimmune disease where the body attacks the gut lining. And you might think, how in the world? You had breast cancer and then Crohn's. But the story makes perfect sense because one of the chemotherapeutic agents that I had actually pokes holes in the gut and causes a more permeable permeable gut. And I also had a genetic predisposition towards Crohn's disease. And Crohn's is an autoimmune disease where the body attacks the gut lining, where you just mistake normal microbial contents for dangerous invaders. And then you start this cascade where the body starts to attack the gut lining. So it kind of makes sense because I poked holes in my gut with the chemo, and then the bacteria snuck into the bloodstream, caused an immune reaction. And 6 months later, I have Crohn's disease. Now, this is interesting because this is why I became a gut expert after the cancer, because I had to figure out how to heal myself. My doctor said, Jill, Crohn's is incurable. You're going to have this forever, lifelong. You're probably going to need multiple surgeries to resect parts of your bowels during your life. You're going to need steroids, probably immune modulating drugs, and get used to this. And I was like, no way. I didn't know a lot, but what I knew was like, this doesn't make sense. There's got to be a way to find root cause. And the last question I asked before I left his office was, Doctor, I don't know a lot, but does diet have anything to do with this? Could I change my diet? And he didn't even pause. And he said, Jill, diet has nothing to do with Crohn's disease. And again, even though I didn't know, my intuition knew this doesn't make sense. Food in the gut, like how could that not have something to do with it? Now, unbeknownst to me at 14, because of probably zinc deficiency and low stomach acid, I became a vegetarian, but I wasn't a very healthy vegetarian. So the decade preceding both cancer and Crohn's, I was more of a carbitarian. And I ate a lot of gluten and I was undiagnosed celiac. So now this picture is starting to make sense because I had gluten in my diet. I had a very poor, high sugar, high carb diet. I still thought I was eating healthy, but I really wasn't. And I lacked meat and protein in that sense that I probably could have used at that time. Cancer, Crohn's. And then what I did is I went on a search for diet and interventions, and I changed my diet, took out gluten, took out specific carbohydrates. And within 2 weeks, my symptoms were resolved. I didn't cure myself from Crohn's in 2 weeks. It took several years to address the gut microbiome. But what I learned in those experiences was like, wow, there's so much more than conventional medicine tells us. And diet does have a lot to do with, not even a lot, it has everything to do with autoimmunity. So that was my fast track education in the middle of medical school and part of my reason for my passion for root cause, functional medicine, and gut health.
Incredible story and so much to unpack there for me, but I'll do my best here because I truly believe that, the doctor of the future needs to be integrative in so that they need to be conventionally trained. Yeah. I've never knocked conventional doctors. They have a great understanding of many things, biophysical understanding, all acute things. But they need to go beyond that, go into the functional training, go into holistic training, go into diet, all those lifestyle, combine the two. And then you have a well-rounded practitioner that can start to address, like you did with yourself, root causes. And the fact you were able to get to your own root causes is amazing. And then start to build on that. So let's start with the diet and toxins, because a big part of that was your conventional doctor said diet has nothing to do with this. Mm-hmm. You knew better in your gut, so to say, your intuition, you knew that diet is a big part of it. Now, a lot of the times when we think of environmental factors, we think of being around chemical plants or, something very in your face, radiation, or, something that, has hazardous toxin signs all over it. But the truth is we ingest toxins every single day. What are some of the things people should be looking out for in their diet that is causing a toxic reaction within them?
Oh, I love that you said that. And I also love that you said the truth is we all know, and I've learned with patients that intuition, that inner self, our inner story, we often know the answers. And if we just take the time to kind of tap into that. And like you said, our conventional system is the best place to be if you have a heart attack or a stroke or any sort of thing. So I love that we can do that. But what the toolbox is a little limited because drugs and surgery are primarily the answers. And what you're saying is we need to expand our toolbox because that's a great place to start. And I couldn't agree more. And then your question about toxins, and you're right. We think about, oh my gosh, well, I don't have lead in my paint and I don't have this or that. What I talk about all the time when I'm teaching doctors is something super simple. And it's clean air, clean water, clean food, because those basic inputs are the majority of our toxic load. And I love because it's something we can remember: clean air, clean water, clean food. It's not hard to remember, and it can be complicated to implement, but really it shouldn't be. So clean air, the air that we breathe, 80% of our toxic load comes from the air that we breathe. So nowadays with our VOCs from off-gassing, with our petroleum fuels and things in the air, with mold in so many environments, pollutants and increasing every day and every year, I think it's essential to have some sort of air filtration in your environments, especially if you're indoor. Outdoor dilution is the solution to pollution. So usually outdoor is not as big of a deal, but now with the fires and all of that, California, Colorado, and all over, as we get more and more dry and climate change, the outdoor air can be just as toxic. So I highly recommend a high quality HEPA filtration system with a VOC filter. And there's many companies that do that. But if you get just HEPA, that's the larger particulate like mold spores or particulate pieces in the air. That VOC filter, however, is the 0.3 microns or less, like viruses or formaldehyde or smoke. And you really need both. I have 3 air filters in my small condo. I have 5 at work. And I really think it makes a huge difference. So think about air quality, invest in an air filter. Other ways you can do are putting a high quality MERV rating in your furnace. So just changing that out. You're going to have increased pressure on the airflow. So you may use a little more energy, but to me, it's worth it to have that thicker filter. And you can buy them even with charcoal infiltrated in there and that good filtration system. And of course, now people are using UV lights and all kinds of things. And since COVID, especially, caution with those because some of these devices, whether it's UV or ozone, they may say they don't produce ozone, but if they react to molecular particles in the air, then they can create reactive oxygen. And people with sensitive lungs may react to a UV filter. So be careful with those. I'm not a huge fan because it can cause it doesn't produce the reactive oxygen, but when it reacts with stuff in the air, it can cause some irritants for the lungs. So that's clean air. And dilution is the solution to pollution. I said that again because it's fun to say and easy to remember, but that's where you can just open your windows and you can get some dilutional effects. Sometimes if you can't afford a filtration system, opening and diluting the indoor air is often really helpful. And nowadays with our LEED certified buildings and our incredibly efficient buildings, it's actually more of a problem because we're not getting, I'd rather be in a 100-year-old log cabin with a little bit of cracks in the wood than to be in a highly, downtown LEED certified where there's condensation, there's mold growth, and there's no air exchange from the outside. So that's clean air. Clean water. Again, I grew up on well water. We thought it was clean, but looking back, I'm sure that there was probably contamination. So if you haven't tested or asked your city water supply for a report, you really need to look at this. I have a water filtration system that's on a countertop standalone and also one in my fridge. And the one in my fridge does like everything known to man. In fact, my friend in a suburb close to us had a water boil order on the community when there was an E. coli outbreak, and he used the filter because it filtered out E. coli and had no trouble at all. So clean water. The whole house systems are great, but they are usually reverse osmosis, which takes out the minerals as well. So if you do get that kind of filtration system, you need to think about minerals in your diet because you're going to be drinking acidic water, which if you have osteoporosis or issues with bones, that's going to make that worse. And then the question you asked, finally, were to clean food. I am a huge fan of making sure you know where your food is grown. If you can get local, organic, non-GMO for sure, and as fresh as possible, grow your own if you can, even if it's just herbs on your balcony like I do. And you really want to at least be non-GMO. And you can, if you can't afford all organic, and that be genetically modified, the reason for that is those, especially like corn and soy, the top 6, I think, are corn and soy and cotton and canola oil, wheat. There's maybe a couple I'm missing, peanuts that are genetically modified. They're genetically modified so that they can tolerate things like glyphosate or Roundup applied to them without dying. And so what that means is there's more chemicals applied and they're actually altered proteins in those genetically modified foods. Like the GMO corn is going to be slightly different to your body and maybe more antigenic. So it might stimulate the immune system a little bit more. So, and then organic, if at all possible. And if you can't afford all organic, you can look at the Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen, and they put that out every year. And then at very least, those are the highest pesticide sprayed foods. You want to eat those organic.
Yeah, it's wild how we've taken something like water, food, and air, something we all need. Some of you are just about to drink right there at the water, and made it into the toxins we're ingesting, the most toxic substances. Yeah. It's really so sad to see these 3 things become the most toxic. But I want to go into that idea of where you live in the direct environment. We know outdoors is usually a better situation unless you have those things like fires and other pollutants. But we basically made our homes into some areas where we become sick. sick building syndrome. And a large part of that has to do with mold. And I know you're a mold expert. You see lots of mold patients. What percentage would you say are actually dealing with mold that come into your practice?
It's shocking. And my story, I got really sick from mold about 5 or 6 years ago after the Boulder floods. I didn't know what was going on. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't walk upstairs. I had rashes and found out it was mold, and I had to leave my office. And so once again, my life is experiential. I experience something and then I learn and then I go on and teach others about it. So once again, I had to learn mold. I always said I'll never be the mold expert. Well, the divine or universe had a different
never
plan.
say never.
Exactly. So learned that. Also had to get well. That was actually way harder than both Crohn's and cancer, because it was one of these things that was fairly invisible. People didn't understand it. And I was actually probably more sick, and especially mentally. One of the things I talk about in my book that's so interesting is the mold has this way of taking out your insight. So you have this, it's almost hard to tell when you're exposed or how badly you're affected. And granted, you don't feel well, but it's very subtle. And it also has kind of a traumatic response to it. So people often have connection to trauma or feeling like PTSD or fight or flight because of the chemical exposure. So mold is everywhere, but it's a lot worse as we get these more environmentally sound buildings, which are great for efficiency. But like I said, then if you get condensation or changes in temperature, you can have issues. A lot of the construction nowadays is so quickly put up, and the materials are much more, instead of stone and brick and concrete, they're more like cardboard, which is the particle board or those things. And those are, if they get damp as you're constructing, there could be mold in them. And then all it takes is a tiny bit of moisture in your house, and it can grow, and you can have leaks from your fridge and your washing machine and under your sink, and you name it. Attics, condensation, intrusion through the windows during a storm. And people think, oh, no big deal, wipe up the water. But it often, if it saturates a porous material, you are ripe for mold growth. And over time, it becomes a really big issue. And I would say it's really growing in poor construction materials, the amount of people that are indoors. And I think with the pandemic, we saw more because all of a sudden people were stuck in their homes. If they had an issue, they didn't get as much outside time. I think the statistics say about 1 in 4 buildings in the US are affected by mold.
Wow. Think about that. 25% of us right now listening are probably in a building that's impacted by mold. And I know this is very true for, southern areas where it's humid. Everyone I know who's gotten mold, Tessa, Lisa, Emma, whatever it is, have shown positive mold spores in that area without even knowing, and they're sleeping there. That's the scary part of it. But the good news is you have wonderful doctors such as yourself to help. And I know part of your treatment plan that you talk about are targeted binders. Can you go into that and what that means?
Sure. And I just noticed I didn't answer the other part of your question, was like people coming into the clinic, how many people. And when I first had the mold illness, I very deliberately was getting myself well. And I thought, I'm not going to go back to the clinic and assume that everything's mold, right? Because how we have those lenses where we see that everything's this. And I was very deliberate, like I am going to look for it, but I'm not going to assume that everybody has mold illness. And more often than not, I'd go deep, I'd do the testing, and we can talk about testing and stuff too. And I would be like, oh my gosh, this is mold again. This can't be, like, how often? So when you say how many people, I would say chronic complex illness like autoimmunity, neurodegenerative diseases, or just things where people are mysteriously fatigued, brain fog, not functioning their best. I would say about 50% or greater. And I'm being conservative with that. Our root issues are mold.
Huge number. Yeah. And again, that's why it's so scary. But to get back to that now, good part of it all, the treatment.
Yes, so the binders.
The targeted binders. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Okay. So, and a lot of studies have come out now. I don't have this memorized, but I'll give you some tidbits. But there are some studies now on very specific substances for specific mycotoxins. So what happens, I'll give you just a tiny primer on mold. We have the spores, which are fairly large. They're typically like taken in air samples and things. And those typically aren't as antigenic or immune reactive as the toxins that mold produces. So we have the mold itself, which could be Aspergillus or Chaetomium or Stachybotrys or Walaria or any of these. And those are certainly bad and problematic. And if you have them in air samples, it's an issue. Typically something like a black mold, like Chaetomium or Stachy, if you are finding that in your air, it's a massive issue because it typically hides wet, damp things under floorboards, and it's not in the air. So the other kind of testing you can do is testing the dust for DNA of mold. That's called an ERMI. And the ERMI data isn't the best. So we now call that qPCR. It's just another name for the type of testing it's done. And any person can do this without a doctor or even an inspector. You can get a dust sample yourself and test your house. And you can look at the species that are in the dust in your mold. So still we're talking about spores and mold. And then the next level is particulate, like if after remediation, I always say it's almost like if you had a dried flower and you flicked it or blew on it and the particulate. So this dead mold particulate goes into 1 million fragments, and those fragments are super immunotoxic. So even if it's dead and you've remediated, but you have fragments of dead old particulate from mold, that can still cause immune damage and inflammation. And then the last thing is the mycotoxins that the mold actually produces. Now, this could be the mold is hiding behind the wall. Your air samples are perfect, but it's still producing toxins. And that's that level of the VOCs. It's like 0.3 microns. And these are things like trichocythines, ochratoxin, aflatoxin, gliotoxin. And you can measure these as well. You can measure them in the urine of humans, and you can also measure them in a dust sample. So those are kind of the levels. And then with binders, we know that certain types of toxins are better bound by certain things. For example, ochratoxin, which is typically from Aspergillus penicillin, the prescription binder cholestyramine tends to be really effective for that one. And same with clay or Saccharomyces boulardii or glycomannans. And then things like trichocythines, which are the really toxic immunosuppressive ones from the black molds. Those I think are better bound by charcoal, and clay works too. So I often, because there's usually more than one in each environment and each person, I'll use combinations. So clay and charcoal are two of my favorites. Zeolite is excellent and also binds to metals. Glycomannans, chlorella, and even just fiber like citrus pectin can be good for both organophosphates and molds.
Yeah. And it's so great that you're getting to this level of personalization, not just saying, hey, let's just throw something and see how it goes, because that is a kind of old antiquated way of going about it. Protocols for just general mold versus really being specific. And now one of the detoxification methods, you talk about is NAD. And something I know very well, we do a lot of NAD infusions here in all sorts of forms. And tell me, how does NAD help to detoxify the body from mold?
Okay, so it's really interesting because glutathione and NAD are critical factors for our detox. NAD is like the fuel to make ATP for our cells. So it's critical for every cell in our body. And actually our mitochondria, which is the biggest marker of aging or anti-aging and the damage that happens to mitochondria. If we could prevent mitochondrial damage, we wouldn't age, we wouldn't get Alzheimer's, we wouldn't get any of these things. Unfortunately, we haven't figured that out exactly yet, but anything in that realm, NAD is one of those things that's actually anti-aging because it helps restore normal integrity of the cells and give us the fuel. But what we know is things like Aspergillus and Candida, any fungal species, they actually deplete NADPH, which is the precursor of NAD, and the currency for NAD. So that's why many people do better when they take NAD. It's a critical thing. And so mold is really nasty because it depletes glutathione and it depletes NADPH. And those are two critical factors in energy and detox and just the cellular currency. So giving those back is just very helpful in many cases. I usually start with either glutathione or, for those who don't tolerate glutathione, precursors. And you still need methyl donors and things like that. Precursors could be N-acetylcysteine, lipoic acid, liver support like milk thistle, vitamin C, glycine, glutamine. Those are all kind of precursors of glutathione. So some people don't do well on glutathione, but they can still take precursors. And then the NAD often comes in a little later because if someone's really, really sick and you give them a load of NAD, they're going to push detox so heavy they get more toxic and more sick, even if they need it. So NAD is great for the healthy person to start on. And if you're really sick, I often don't do that first. I do that a little bit into the protocol because it overwhelms the system. It's almost like it turns it on full blast and the body's like, whoa, what'd you do to me?
That's what a lot of people don't realize, that you can't just detox the body without actually having it in a place where it's ready. You got to get the organs of elimination going. You got to get rid of some things a little bit more gentler. And then you could start to turn on the spigot, right? And NAD, if you just turn that on at once, people have serious reactions that you don't want in there. Now, one of the things we've noticed, and I know lots of other practices and doctors have noticed this as well, is the correlation of Lyme disease with mold. It seems to go hand in hand. And a lot of times it seems that almost doctors who may not know start to misdiagnose one or the other and start to treat one or the other. But what have you seen in your practice and in your experience about Lyme and mold? Are they truly just often misdiagnosed, or do they actually go together?
Great question. So I frame functional medicine in a very simple paradigm, and I think it fits what we're talking about: toxic load and infectious burden. And I think almost every chronic patient that I see, I know you're nodding, you see this too in your clinics, is a combination of toxic load and infectious burden. And how they fit together is we all have dormant infections in our system. I've never once seen a patient that doesn't have an old infection that is dormant. It's not bothering them, because most 95% of college-age kids have had mono, which is Epstein-Barr. And then most of them have had some sort of a HHV 6 or 7 or some childhood exanthem, like a viral infection, strep throat, et cetera. And then many people are bit by ticks, but also like things like Bartonella, cat scratches or spiders, or mosquitoes carry some of these things like West Nile. And a lot of these things didn't really, because they had strong, robust immune systems, they might have got infected, had a very short illness or some little thing or nothing at all, but they're carrying these bugs or spirochetes or viruses in their system. And our immune system is created to keep those in check. So if you're healthy, you're living well, you're doing well, you don't have a big toxic load, you might have a lot of things that are under the surface, but they never cause symptoms. They don't bother you. And that's how we're meant to live. Like, we're meant to be able to control these, not that we never get infected. But what happens in a moldy environment, many of the toxins I mentioned, especially the trichosaphines, are massively immunosuppressive. There's one called mycophenolic acid that can be tested in the urine. That's usually from Aspergillus, but can be from other species. And this in particular is used to make the drug Cellcept, which is for organ transplant, to compromise the immune system so that they can, so literally they use that mold mycotoxin to cause immune suppression. It's one of the strongest immunosuppressants known to man. And I see people all the time that walk in with mycophenolic acid levels off the chart. I'm like, it's like you're on Cellcept, right? It's like you're an organ transplant. So wouldn't it make sense then, if you're completely immune suppressed, you're in this moldy environment, things that weren't bothering you, like a Lyme tick bite from 4 years old, starts to pop up, and it's truly an infection and it's getting out of hand and it's causing symptoms. But it's not just the fact that you have that infection. It's the fact that your immune system is completely not doing its job. So I always think of it in that layer too, because usually I'll treat the toxic exposure, the mold first. And then some people don't need aggressive treatment for infections, because if their immune system comes back online, often we do both, but I usually don't treat the infection, and I don't do a huge amount with metals or that until we first get the exposure down and say, where is the immune system at? Can it come back online? Because often if we get rid of that mycophenolic acid, and that's not the only immunosuppressive mycotoxin, there's others, that's just one we know about, then they can do the fighting of the infections. So that's kind of how the common circumstance would be: someone comes in really sick. Top Lyme symptoms or the tick-borne infections would be fatigue and pain of some sort. There's many others, but those are super common. And they might have brain fog, fatigue, pain, neurological things like numbness, tingling, weakness. And I kind of try to say what's in the environment. And if there's a massive mold issue, we ignore the Lyme temporarily and support their immune system and get them detoxed. And then we reevaluate and say, okay, is the Lyme still here? And many people still need treatment, but not everybody does.
Yeah. My father was a doctor and talks a lot about this, always says, listen, you got to clean the terrain before you get rid of the mice and the cockroaches, right? Yes. You can't just set the traps, which would be antibiotics, in a terrible environment. You got to first get the environment clean, get the organs, get detox going. Then you could go in and start to address those pests, which are your Borrelia, your Babesia, everything else that usually comes packaged. Yes. It's never one or the other.
Right, exactly.
Now, a big portion of toxicity and what we're seeing a lot, I feel like in neurological conditions, and what you hear a lot about is heavy metals. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are a little bit on the fence as how much of a cause heavy metals in our environment or that we're consuming can lead to certain conditions and certain issues. But what are your thoughts in general on the prevalence of heavy metals and how that relates to neurological conditions?
Yeah, so I rarely, as we just talked about, see someone with one thing, like with just mercury toxicity. And especially years ago, I've been doing this about 20 years, I did often see, thyroiditis or hormone imbalance or a little bit of extra mercury. It was much more simple. And now it is never simple. It's always layered and it's always multiple things. So metals are usually part of the picture. I rarely see them alone. And they do add to the load. But once again, if you think about what we first talked about with mold trashes the detox system. So often metals, the same as the infections, it looks like someone's incredibly toxic, and it could be chemicals or metals. if they're in a moldy environment because their detox is just trashed. It's tanked. There's no glutathione. But again, if I get them detox, sometimes it's not as big of a deal, or they can actually, because we forget our bodies are kind of created or made or, designed to detoxify. So we are a detox machine. And if we are given the right circumstances, the right fuel, the right air, water, food that's clean, we can actually handle quite a toxic load and do fine. So it's not something to be afraid of. But because the load, it overloads our system, the bucket gets full and spills over the top. And because of that, if we decrease that load, then we say, what's left? What else is here? If, though, there's someone who still has metals, it is an issue. You do need detox. I start with the gut. I do a lot of zeolite and binders through the gut and do, like lipoic acid, N-acetylcysteine, glutathione, and then make sure we're repleting minerals. I do a little bit of DMSA. I don't use a lot of EDTA because I find I have a few colleagues that are experts in that. And if you don't know what you're doing with the IV chelation, you can mobilize something that's not excreted and get someone worse. So I'm incredibly respectful for that. It's a great therapy for the right person. And I leave that to someone who that's all they do and they're really good at it. And I'm sure with your clinics and stuff, not against it at all, but I'm that's not my expertise, but I know when it works and I know when to refer people. And for lead, especially EDTA and heart disease, there's a lot of data and it can be incredibly effective. For mercury, I find oral DMSA or oral zeolite can be just as effective.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. That chelation is not just chelation. It's not just you just jump in and do 20, EDTA IVs and that's it. Depending on who it is, it could be absolutely detrimental. And you could start to move things that are in connective tissue and start to deposit in the brain, even the heart or elsewhere. And that's where it gets really tricky. And you do have to be skilled. And that's where quality comes in over quantity and knowing what you're doing. So I'm glad you brought that up. Now, mercury amalgams, is that something you take case by case, or are you asking your patients to remove them at the right time in all cases?
Gosh, it's all these things are expensive, right? So I'm always checking, where are you at? What you afford this area, whether it's cavitations or root canals that have failed or they're leaking into the, and we talk about lipopolysaccharides and endotoxemia, which is the dumping of the gut contents into the bloodstream and a huge trigger for diabetes and heart disease and obesity and all that. It's called LPS, endotoxemia. That can happen in your mouth as well. So you can have this leakage of bacteria into the bloodstream, which causes it may be, in my mind, one of the most potent immune triggers of all, the lipopolysaccharide, the LPS, and it can happen in the mouth. So you mentioned mercury, but I got a little bit bigger than just mercury, because what I see maybe more often than just mercury is old cavitations, like where your wisdom teeth and you have a little pocket of bacteria that's just sitting there for years, or root canals. Root canals are not all bad, but if you have a weak immune system and you're dripping bacteria because there's no way to perfectly sterilize a tooth, then for those people, they don't do well, and they tend to do better if they have those root canals pulled. I'll tell you a quick story on that. This was between the cancer, the Crohn's, and the mold, and I was doing fine, but I had a little psoriasis on my scalp and my body, and I went to a biological dentist, and I had 2 root canals, same meridian, and I learned that those 2 meridians were breast, pancreas, and colon. So breast cancer, Crohn's is in your colon, and the pancreas, I didn't tell you this, but I had pancreatic insufficiency after the mold, and I have had for a while. So that was literally my health history in the teeth. And I was like, okay, let's pull those. Like once I saw the meridians, and when I talk about meridians, if you're not familiar with that, the acupuncture meridians, go through all of our organs. And I am not the expert there either, but I know this stuff is valid. And when I saw that alignment with those, and it was the same tooth on each side. And when I got my teeth pulled, Casper, 1 week later, the psoriasis was gone, and I've never had it since. So there was something there that was clearly, like, I was like, wow, I would have never thought pulling these teeth would have an effect on my autoimmune psoriasis. And it was mild, but it went away, like gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
It's incredibly important what happens to your mouth. And a lot of times dentistry, not to blame them, because I think you're taught this a lot, is you see it as separate, head up. They say just go in the mouth, and it's, but when you talk about those meridians, those are real things that I've talked to many doctors about and have seen the charts of what is connected to what. And it is very true. I don't know if you ever saw the documentary Root Cause, but there's a lot of people there that talk about breast cancer, root canal in the one, and seeing a huge correlation, not just, causative, but that's fascinating that you experienced that again. Now, one of the questions I want to ask you, because I'm hearing this so much, is I'm a big believer in experiential medicine, meaning we experience and we get results, and evidence, of course, is important, but it's not the end all. If that were true, you just follow the evidence and everyone would be healthier or sicker and sicker. Where do you find yourself? Because functional medicine is very evidence-based. Mm-hmm. But you're sitting here talking a lot about experience. And if you followed some of the evidence that many of the doctors probably you worked with in the past were following, you got to go on this, course of action with oncology and that's what the evidence shows us gives us the best chance. And you said, well, my experience showed me something else. Where do you fall on that between experience versus evidence?
Oh, this is a brilliant question. And I love it because I just did an interview earlier this morning. We actually got into this because she said this neuropsychologist you talked to, neurologist, was like, if it's not randomized controlled trial, then he's not going to do it. And all he was doing was SSRIs for mood. He wouldn't consider that the gut or anything else had anything to do with it. So I love that because I am a huge believer. I love the science. I was a bioengineer background. Like I'm very steeped in that science. But as I've grown and learned and seen, I'll say it like this, and then I'll tell you why. Mm-hmm. The place where we see the miracles, the spontaneous healing, the things that are like not expected, it's always outside the box. And when we stay, there's this box that says this is what 30 years of old data has told us has been the standard of care. But the data that's coming out now, it may not be standard of care for another 30 years. So I could wait 30 years and have a lot of people die and get sick and not get well. Or I can go on the very cutting edge of that data and say, okay, we have preliminary data on this vitamin C. Well, that's old now, but use something else, maybe NAD. And my mind is like, is this safe? If there is a safety profile and I know no major risk of harm or we have informed consent, and then there's a possible benefit. First of all, if it's me, I'm going to be on that cutting, bleeding edge. I do stuff to me that I would never do to patients because I'm willing to take the risk, right? I mean, I ride a motorcycle, I got to climb mountains. I do other things like that too, but I don't have any problem with risking and trying stuff on myself to see if it works. And then I can be that judge. And I often give patients that option. Of course, I'm much more careful with them and say, but what we find is when we go outside that box and we say, hey, this makes sense. There's a preliminary study on this ingredient, plasminogens and anti-aging. This is a huge new topic. And can we use this to reverse Alzheimer's? Well, there's just preliminary evidence. But if someone wants to try phosphatidylcholines or precursors of plasminogens, my gosh, that's from, food sources. It's pretty darn safe. Why not try it? So I am definitely one of those docs that is not willing to step outside the box. I hear something in a lecture. It's got decent evidence. I might the next day talk to a patient and say, hey, I just heard about this. What do you think? And then in combination. And what I wanted to say too was, again, I have this science background. I used to live from my neck up as far as analytical and problem solving. And I love to have complex equations in my head. But what I learned, the most powerful medicine, the most powerful answers, and the most powerful miracles that are unexpected healing, this happens when we trust our gut and our intuition. And whether it's tapping into the patient and saying, what do you think? What do you suspect? Most of the time, the patient, if you give them the permission to speak their truth, they have answers that are helping you to help them heal. And they know at a root cause, like something that this may make no sense to you, doctor, but I was wondering about this, or this happened with my family when I was a young child. And so all these are clues. And what I've learned in the last at least 10 to 15 years is that heart-based intuitive sense, which is not science-based, it's a gut instinct, is thousands of times more powerful than the science-based. I think of it as the old analog computer can process so many pieces of data. But when we go to the heart space, we can spontaneously process millions of pieces of data with our intuitive subconscious. And again, this isn't woo-woo. There's actually evidence to support what I'm saying. But I have fully swung. I still use both sides. I still use the science. And what I typically do is I go with that intuitive sense, and then I prove it with the testing and the science and make sure. But I'll tell you what, it is so accurate. And I get so many more really deep insights and ways to solve a problem that I would have never found if I had just stuck to the old analog computer.
Absolutely. It's never black and white. And that's what you got to see. You got to find all those different shades and the colors in between that really make sense. And I even posted about this not long ago, how, following the heart, and the heart gives off the most EMF and it's most powerful. And, I had some doctors on there saying there's no science to this, right? And it was just, you can't say that, it's misinformation. And I was like, come on, like you gotta find it. I can find the science if you want.
And there
right?
is science
out there.
That's
absolutely,
the thing, it's like really powerful science.
It's just not the science they're used to. It's a little bit outside the scope of what you're probably learning in medical school. But
even what you're saying there too, for me, just showing up and really listening with my heart and like really giving them a space that's safe, where they believe that there's hope, where they trust me, and where they know there's unconditional love and acceptance. That might have been woo-woo 20 years ago. That is a foundation of healing.
And it's something you absolutely incorporate in your practice. I remember when I was listening to you on stage at the Biohacking Conference, you talked about heart-based intention, goal setting, purpose-driven medicine, all these things that my ears perked up for that because I love that. I know the difference with many patients. Do they have a purpose to get better? Yes. Do they have a goal to get better? Because it's not going to always be easy and linear healing. You'll have bad days and maybe you don't want to go through with it and change your lifestyle. So you back out of it and you stay in a disease state. Can you talk about how you implement that with patients to really get them to set goals, to see themselves getting better and see it through the finish line?
Oh, this is so important. So this goes to the more metaphysical, but super, super important because we can give all the right protocols, the supplements, the nutrients, the labs, the medications, and still not have a good result. And what I found again in my own journey was I went through a divorce about 6 years ago, and I had before that been married almost 20 years. So that was the only life I'd really known. And what that did for me is it took me out of my comfort zone, threw me into this new, who am I? What's going on? What's life like as a single person? And what it allowed me to do, though, was look at my old patterns of security and comfort and safety. And one of the things I learned in that process was we talk about intuition. I have a really strong intuition, but I didn't trust it. I trusted just other people's opinions. And I was just waffling around. And then the second thing was I didn't really value or love myself. And I was very hard on I could be very kind and loving to the world around me, but I was horrible to myself. So that what happened is that trusting my intuition laid the foundation for me to have self-compassion and self-love in a healthy way. And I feel like I had more healing with learning those things, dealing with my childhood trauma and trusting myself, trusting my intuition, having self-love and compassion, because then I could show patients how to do it. And I could recognize in themselves, it's funny, there's literally data out there. Some Gabor Mate, Vesser Vanderkool, and some of those guys talk about autoimmunity as a process of our self-loathing, because it's attack of self, right? I wouldn't say everybody has that, but there are a lot of commonality. And breast cancer itself, we see women that are more like nurturing kinds. It's from the breast, the nurturing organ. But what happens is we're over-nurturing to our loved ones, but we forget to nurture ourselves, and we're actually not taking care of ourselves. So those lessons with autoimmunity and breast cancer became very profound healing of my own. And so now I can recognize if someone has an old pattern of trauma or distrust or lack of self-confidence or self-loathing, and I go to those places. I'm not the expert, but I know people they can go to help do that work. And I literally write on a prescription pad, be kind to yourself. Because that right there is just so powerful. And sometimes in my mirror, my bathroom cabinet, still to this day, I have a little sticky note that says, what does she need from me today? Mm-hmm. And that's just a reminder for me to say, okay, I can actually have a need and fulfill a need that before it was like, take care of everybody else, not yourself. So these little shifts that may sound like not science-based can be the most powerful foundations, because nowadays when I see these complex chronic people, they've had all the good supplements, they've been amazing doctors, but the work inside is where it really starts to show a shift.
It's so important. It's the little things. There's nothing bigger, as they say. And I totally agree. I mean, through all the different biohacks and therapies and technologies I've used, gratitude, meditation, slowing down, people around me showing more love have been the greatest, most profound ones on my health, at least. Now, you got a lot going on right now. I can see you have a documentary coming out. You got another book. Could you talk about those a little bit?
Sure. So it's interesting. I've been probably 8 years ago, I had on my heart, I'm supposed to write a book. It was kind of a divine thing that I just felt this. And I was like, who am I? I don't know what to do. Woe is me. And then I just kind of got the download, you know what? This is like telling your story, and there's more to come. And I waited 8 years because I had a lot more to learn. And now it's finally in the process. It'll be published in February 2023. It's called Unexpected. And it's a finding resilience through functional medicine, science, and faith. And what I do is bridge the two worlds, because I love science, but I also love, and I say faith. For me, I do have a personal faith, but it's bigger than that. It could be any sort of religious, not religious, atheist, doesn't matter. It's something bigger than ourselves, greater purpose. For me, it happens to be partially faith, but it's bigger than that. It's like this intuitive versus the science mind, pulling those things together and finding resilience on a foundation of a bigger scope of medicine. And that's my story. And I write about it. That'll be out in February. And then, so stay tuned. And then the documentary, this was funny because I'm in the middle of writing my book, and January 2021 came along right in the middle of the pandemic. We're all sitting at home. And I literally was in my meditation spot and I had to download again. And I was like, people are on screens. I mean, they're not reading books like they used to be. And granted, I think my book will be read, but I need to, if I want to impact, and my desire is, I don't care about fame or any of that. I do care about inspiring and impacting. And I thought, if I want to impact people, I need to be where they're at. So I thought, well, why don't I do a documentary? Now, this is funny. I have no experience. I have no background in production. I had nothing, but it was just like, okay, well, I know from experience, if I move forward with a vision or a purpose, if it's supposed to happen, the things will come together. Within a week, I had producer, director, full team, executive, they all came like, we love this. Let's do this. And then Casper, the best thing, I'm like, well, let's write up a budget. We need money. And then again, I just knew if it was supposed to happen, we get the money. Within 3 months, I had one single investor said, we'll give you the full amount. It was a lot of money. And we got the film funded. And then we started filming in May of last year. We're finished filming. We're in the final, we call it the picture lock right now, getting the sound. And we're hoping to get into the film festivals this fall. It's called Doctor Patient. And it also follows my own journey and some of the patients that I treat. So that's all coming out next year.
Incredibly exciting. And congrats on manifesting all of that. You know, that's the power, I believe, of manifestation. When you're truly aligned, things happen in your favor.
It does.
Not against you.
Like, how did this happen?
Yeah. And this is coming from someone not only as a doctor, but a patient yourself. And that's the title, I'm sure, Dr. Patient there. That's amazing. Dr. Carnahan, where can people learn more about you?
Well, as we know, both Instagram is great. It's just Dr. Jill. Yeah, Dr. Jill Carnahan. I have so many posts and articles and things. I put all kinds of information there. And my website is loaded with 10 years of blogs, like weekly blogs and information on Lyme and mold and everything we talked about here, detox, all free. So that's just my name, jillcarnahan.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a fun conversation.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, be on the lookout for Unexpected coming out soon, as well as the documentary Dr. Patient. And remember to be kind to yourself. That's what I pulled out of this. In a toxic world, you can still thrive, but regardless, always be kind to yourself. Until next time, continue writing your own healing story.